I congratulate both sides on reaching the quarterfinal round, which is my 16th Penn tournament.
Cool. So we have a case. Oh,
You good?
okay.
I'm good.
Well,
Yeah.
Thank you to everybody who's in the round. Guys, love you guys. Have had great rounds with you guys. We have a case we are really excited about. Hope you enjoy it too. We're going to say it's late 1989. We think during the introductions of local and national elections in the Soviet Union should have also implemented special economic zones in not major cities. Couple background about the Russian economy and the Soviet economy at the time, and the political system. So first, the Russian economy. We first want to talk about, this is like, they had mainstay gas and oil production was plummeting in the 1980s, which was causing financial catastrophic issues for the government because oil revenues were a vital source of budget income and foreign exchange. They were entering into acute external debt crisis as a result of heavy external borrowing during Gorbachev's rule. The Russian economy was structured far more disoriented than the rest of Eastern Europe at the time.
Disorganized.
Like, they were just had really poor central planning overall.
Sure.
And had issues with producing a negative value-added tax.
What does that mean?
So basically, like, because they had a value-added tax, the value of products were so low compared to the output that they were getting paid basically a negative tax. Because the inflation from the time in which the good was started to be created, when they put the inputs in, to when the manufactured good was actually done, that the value-added tax was actually losing the government.
Can you talk to me about how that functioning in the USSR? Like, is it added as a sales tax, or how is how if I'm a person, how does the VAT affect me?
Basically, what that means is all of the different inputs that they put in originally to it. So
for a company, the cost of goods.
Yeah, basically.
Okay.
So they would tax the cost of goods. By the time that the good was being produced, the inflation had risen so far that oftentimes they were creating negative value-added taxes, where the government was losing money comparatively. So while the government was still gaining, that if they had taxed at the beginning rather than the end output, they were losing money.
So the basic macro that you're saying here is
there's
inflation was so high that the government was unable to maintain, it could not keep accounts and rules, basically, is what you're saying. Yep.
And historically lacked democratic governance. The other things that are happening in the Soviet Union at the time, you had already had the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact and peaceful revolution against Soviet-imposed communist regimes were peacefully toppled around Eastern Europe. They had pressure for greater democracy. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1989 introduced little competitive elections at the local level, which they called the Congress People of Deputies, but they had not lifted the ban on political parties. This is 4 years before they open up the market. In reality, we're saying before that they should have had special economic zones.
What are these special economic zones?
Basically, they are physically located geographical zones. So maybe you draw 10 by 10 box basically.
How large are they?
I mean, there's no specific size. Each country has done them slightly differently. They're about the size of a medium city.
Sure. Okay.
In which anyone operating within those portions will not have property taxes. There will not be corporate taxes, but foreign corporations will be allowed to freely enter, set up manufacturing.
So you said that the SEZs will have taxes that are lower than.
Yeah, they will basically have no taxes, no tariffs.
No.
Nothing, basically.
Russian citizens living in the SEZs, do they pay income tax? No.
If they pay, it is basically negligibly low.
I see. So your case is that in non-major cities, so we're not talking about Moscow,
not talking about Moscow, not talking about St. Petersburg, not talking about Omsk, other areas that are either small towns in the status quo or entirely rural in the status quo.
Okay, I see. And you're saying in those areas basically have no corporate taxation, no individual income taxation either?
And allow foreign corporations.
Sure, okay.
Yeah.
Are there other capital constraints or any provisions that bar foreign direct investment in other areas of Russia at this point in time?
Yeah, so the Soviet Union is almost entirely at this point barring foreign corporations. If you're a foreign corporation, you simply cannot operate. You cannot operate in the Soviet Union. You can't enter. A lot of times they have heavy restrictions on foreign direct investment. You can't directly invest in anything. You have to invest into the government. which is still like a lot of times the government turns away funding, and like corporations oftentimes just didn't want to fund the Soviet Union. Honestly,
sure. The other question I had was, so you said there was rising debt, and they're financially constrained. So this obviously is effectively a subsidy for investment in these areas. So I'm wondering how large the interest that the Soviet Union is paying on debt at this point in time relative to the cost of this plan.
Yeah, so a couple different things. One, the Soviet Union borrowed, starting in the early 80s, from some foreign banks. These foreign banks were primarily set up in places like Eastern Europe that were not currently part of the Soviet Union and did some trading with London banks.
Sure.
But the majority of their debt that they have is internally accrued. So they are borrowing from one another at like relatively high interest rates. So like basically the Soviet Union borrowed from Poland, Poland turned around and borrowed from the Soviet Union, and as a result, neither could pay back their debt obligations because they spent the money into like government, whatever they were spending the money for, and so borrowed more to be able to pay back the obligations to each other.
I'm interested about the debt from foreign banks. Was that denominated in rubles or was that denominated in the other country's currency?
Usually the pound.
Got it.
It like overwhelmingly it was the like largest that wasn't happening in already Eastern European countries, in which case it would have been in the ruble, was happening from a couple London banks that were willing to buy Soviet bonds.
All right. The other question I had was, sorry I'm asking so many questions. It's just like I don't know all the details about like the 1989 Russian economy. So I have a couple other questions. So first, so at this point in time, what is the sort of development of just Russian firms within Moscow and large cities?
Yeah. Okay. So within what is now Russia proper, there is manufacturing and industry. They are like pretty poorly run. There is a lot of kickbacks being informally given to people at the top. Like people within the party are used to accruing large corruption benefits. But when you get out, like outside of what is like mainstream Russia, we think about, you get into the more resource-heavy zones. That's the Baltics and places on the eastern side of Russia. Those places where you get the oil, where you get large amounts of the minerals, tend to be like resource extraction companies, which is where they are exporting the majority of their goods. So that's how they're accruing foreign capital. They're exporting natural resources.
Got it. But currently, though, most of the firms are concentrated in larger cities.
Yeah, so most of the manufacturing firms are concentrated in larger cities. Resource tends to be better just because like the government has a more vested interest in being able to collect foreign currency. And then when you have the countries that are in the Warsaw Pact, you had significantly better organization just because they had stricter regulations on things like corruption.
Okay,
so this issue is like in comparative countries right around you that were ex-communist and are now having different levels of transition to either pseudo-communist governments or democratic governments or like dictatorships have better organized economies despite not having functionally different economies.
Okay, sweet. I'm mostly looking at here. Can you just repeat case statement, just the line case statement?
Absolutely. In late 1989, with the introduction of local and national elections in the Soviet Union, this House, as the Soviet Union, should have implemented special economic zones.
All right, sweet.
Couple more questions. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So like different countries, different special economic zones run them differently in terms of currencies.
Mm-hmm.
Things in the Russian SEC would still be denominated in rubles or no?
Probably.
Okay.
Yeah.
Similarly, there are different levels of like exemption from labor regulation and so on. What's the stance on that?
Yeah. So we're going to say that this would be pretty free on labor. Like
what does pretty free?
There would be very limited restrictions. We think
like are there minimum wages?
Nope.
Are there
no minimum wages? The two different things we think are most likely. You can make arguments as to why other regulations might be likely or might not be likely. We think are going to be child labor, so anyone under the age of 12 isn't going to be allowed to work, and that there will be a maximum labor day of 20 hours.
20 hours.
Yeah, which is what the Chinese special economic zones in the 80s looked like as well.
All right, sounds good.
Though, yeah, obviously,
sorry, I think you mentioned this. I just forgot. So Russian firms that also like Russian firms that are owned by like Russians in these SECs would also not be paying taxes.
Exactly.
All right, sounds good. I have no further questions.
Yeah, I know.
Great. Cool. Everybody else ready?
Yeah.
Awesome. 3 independent points. The first thing we want to talk about are the goals of the USSR. First, we think the government legitimacy of the USSR is dependent on the quality of life of the average person in the Soviet Union for 3 reasons. First, we're going to argue that an individual can't meaningfully consent into a society without the tools to make the decision intelligently, without the tools of education and substance, without a basic level of food, water, shelter. Humanity cannot take the time to make a decision to consent into. And without education, we cannot make an informed decision as well. Secondly, we are going to argue that if one were forced to choose a society to opt into without knowing what station they would hold within that society, they would always pick one that offered basic substance and opportunity as a broad swath of society as possible. We think the means in which society maximizes that opportunity are the most just then. Third, we're going to say, even if there is no moral obligation, they position themselves as the only actor to be able to take action within the Soviet Union, and thus are optically responsible for the welfare of individuals they have isolated from alternative forms of protection. Moreover, they have empowered their population to replace them if they no longer can achieve basic welfare. The second independent point we want to talk about, though, are economics within these zones. First, we're going to say that SEZs increase foreign direct investment for 3 reasons. One, it raises the available capital without forcing the government to borrow, which allows money to flow into the Soviet Union. 2, it increases employment because SEZs provide a comparatively more open market that allows individuals to choose employment opportunity and exit the market if it becomes less appealing than non-SEZ industries. And 3, increase skilled, specialized workers, which increase the productivity of workers, and as a result, create an incentive for firms to pay their current employees at a higher wage rather than take on new workers that it would incur training costs. Secondly, we're going to say that SEZs increase specialization of the industry. When foreign corporations choose which markets to enter into, they compare comparative factors: labor, available domestic inputs, human capital, and the cost of transportation to the next manufacturing stage or consumer markets. And the Soviets offer significant competitive benefits in 3 of them. First, we're going to say they offer high amounts of natural resources and primary inputs like steel and oil. Secondly, they have high portions of the population, including women, which have basic education and human capital skills, despite not having high-skilled jobs in the status quo. And they are very close to large consumer markets, domestically and within Western Europe, that would be willing to purchase these manufactured goods. We see 3 impacts from this specialization. First, companies within SEZ zones would have an incentive not to lower wages in a race to the bottom because all other total cost factors are comparatively low. Second, foreign corporations create internal incentives to stay in the Soviet Union regardless of future tax or regulation increases. And third, global markets begin to optically associate certain products within Soviet outputs, which allow the Soviet companies in non-SEZ areas to also benefit from the ability to raise prices and revenues. The third subpoint we want to talk about, though, is SEZs increase agricultural productivity. In the status quo, Russia still has large numbers of subsistence farmers that work on tracts of land that are largely undeveloped in the eastern parts of the country. We are going to argue that this is incredibly inefficient. Subsistence farmers in the status quo have no incentive to produce more good than they can eat themselves, because acquiring additional material and wealth doesn't allow them to buy more land, expand their farms, or improve their living conditions meaningfully. Moreover, many subsistence farmers work within the small tracts of land necessary to compete with each other, meaning farm allocation is inconsistent. Our side of the house solves this problem in 3 ways. First, more and more of the rural poor will urbanize. Their small plots of land are then collectivized into larger corporate-owned farming operations. These farms have more capital investments and in the form of tractors, expensive equipment, which make them drastically more effective. What's up, Nathan?
Cool. So when in many Southeastern Asian countries that liberalized land production so that lords, for example, were dispossessed with a free market system without forced distribution to individual peasants, what happened?
Okay, so I think necessarily in those situations, those were farmers happening within these areas, in which case they forced the people off their land. But 2 different conditions are different within Russia. First, the amount of land available. Given that Russia is the 2nd largest country in terms of geographical location, even if they force them off their land here, given the amount of arable land will always exceed the number of people, they can simply pick up and move somewhere else. Though that sucks, that is probably not that bad comparatively. And secondly, we think these corporations have an incentive to pay for this land, because the places where people currently are probably the best off. Thus, instead of just forcing them off their land, in which case they don't get those marginal benefits because some people will fight back, we necessarily think they're incentivized to pay those individuals, which is our second thing, which is rural poor who do not urbanize are now having incentives to produce at a subsistence level, as increased wealth now allows them to move to the cities. And third, that larger corporations, especially state-owned ones, that move into these areas have an incentive to offer status quo farms and good deals on their land to get contingent fields for development and allows farmers to urbanize quickly. Fourth, we're going to say this allows for a better allocation of government resources. As urbanization is naturally happening with a shift away from agricultural society, the This allows for the supported central planning, which is preferable for the society for 4 reasons. 1, more people located at convenient distances means that all services are met with minimum levels of development. 2, the expansion of services means an increase in demand. The barrier cost of creating another location is only then taken on when affordable, rather than the most expansion that can happen trading off. This means you get 1 hospital that is bigger instead of 2 hospitals that are smaller and not serving large populations. 3, you can have high-density subsidized housing can be provided, which lowers the cost of living in SEZs. And 4, it allows for long-term surplus labor, which encourages companies to have higher wages and benefit from enticing workers, giving the average workers higher bargaining power. The third independent point we want to talk about, though, is economics outside these zones. The first thing we want to talk about is the element of inevitability, which is present for 4 reasons, meaning they're eventually going to have to open up the country for everybody to have foreign corporations. We think it is preferable on our stand. 1, given the Soviet government has already been willing to host elections under the guise of the communist name, the general populace will be forced will force the party towards free market conditions that will open up the country to foreign enterprise. 2, the average daily individual is at best neutral towards the communist government and is most likely simply in favor of anything that raises their quality of life. This means without success, in the Soviet economy, they will push for a government that opens up the market development. And 3, given the debt obligations of the Soviet government being so high, and being able to, with the inability to continue borrowing money to finance items that the state will produce, like agriculture products, this is financially impossible without doing this, meaning the majority of the country in rural farms would be unable to even turn subsistence, leading to large famines in the Soviet Union. And 4, even if Saab can convince you that the Soviets will successfly counteract all of these issues, the recently independent Eastern nations like Poland are also likely to open up their borders for all of the other reasons, meaning the optical comparison of the average citizen is still between the societies that have access to modern goods and those that don't. We think there are 3. The implication of this has 3 impacts. 1, eventually the government will be forced to open up their economy, providing small zones that quell the demand of foreign corporations, but don't erode the legitimacy of the government. 2, SEZs allow the government to sketch areas disincluding natural resource pools, so the wealth isn't sucked out of the country. And 3, allowing for the government to create further urban centers, which aid central planning and the efficacy of urbanization. The final thing we want to talk about, though, is this raise the competitive rates of state-run enterprises in the areas for 2 reasons. First, when it comes to the products being produced in this way, they make the state-run industries more effective. When they are competing against each other, or when they are providing the input goods for the other's output, necessarily there is then an incentive from the cross-competition to necessarily lower prices. But secondly, you raise labor standards in both industries by creating competition between the 2 areas, especially since raising wages often harms the profits of the industry. You get non-employment benefits. For all these reasons, we are proposed.
I think Prime Minister and Paul Pung, Leader of Opposition.
Alright, everyone good? Yes, good. Thanks, everyone. So the previous speech wasn't a case. There's a list of taglines, but thankfully, none of that is going to be relevant, because what we're going to advocate in this debate is, given the fact that there is rising debt, inflation, and economic turmoil, you cannot simultaneously cross-subsidize effectively firms going into these tiny cities in the middle of nowhere, while simultaneously subsidizing foreign direct investment in areas like Moscow, St. Petersburg, and so on. Here's how this debate breaks down. What we're defending on our side of the house is to eliminate the corporate income tax, etc., in areas like Moscow, in areas like St. Petersburg instead. Then the debate becomes a question as to whether or not you as the Soviet Union want development in large cities like Moscow, large cities like St. Petersburg, or random areas in the middle of nowhere. That's what this debate comes down to. So all of this stuff about the PMC, about how foreign direct investment is good, are all irrelevant to the round. The question is whether it's preferable to have that investment in areas like Moscow as opposed to nowhere. 2 constructive arguments then as to why we're preferable. The first argument I want to make is why it is the case that it's preferable to use all of the capital you have right now to develop in Moscow. To be clear, it is not the case the Soviet Union can simultaneously cross-subsidize the development in Moscow as well as small areas for 2 reasons. First, there's rising debt that is occurring at this point in time. They are right to point out that like the Soviet Union is mired in debt and economic turmoil. It is simply unaffordable to do both. Why? Because when it's the case that you waive things like the corporate income tax, that is revenue that you lose that otherwise finances social services. So it cannot simultaneously be the case that at this point in time that you subsidize like random places in the middle of nowhere while also subsidizing Moscow. Secondly, we think that in many cases, as we're going to argue under our model of development, what we're going to suggest is that if it's the case that you essentially subsidize both Moscow and random areas, effectively you've done nothing except subsidize development to Russia writ large, which doesn't create the concentrated incentives to urbanize. Our argument in this debate, therefore, will be an explanation as to why urbanization is the path to development, and why that leads to long-term economic development. We're going to give you 6 reasons as to why it's preferable on our side of the house to have development primarily concentrated in urban areas. First, we're going to say that in general, so more broadly, these 6 arguments are going to explain as to why we get better foreign direct investment. Fortunately, they concede that foreign direct investment is good, so if we can demonstrate we get higher quality foreign direct investment, we win this debate. That's where the 6 reasons come. First, we believe that the transaction costs for firms operating are much lower when it's the case that a lot of firms in general are concentrated in one particular city. So the obvious example that, of course, the Princeton would make is it's probably easy for McKinsey to operate in New York City because all their clients have to be located there. More seriously, though, I just do think it's the case that if a client has counterparties and so on, we believe it's easier for them in many cases to sell and have those sort of contracts where you don't have to spend large amounts in transportation. Especially true in an area where there aren't transportation networks at this point in time. So unlike areas like Canada, for example, there simply isn't a state-owned airline at this point in time that is as effective. No, they do have airlines, but they're not as effective as Air Canada was, which was cross-subsidized through the 1970s. Secondly, we believe that we have a better access to the labor market as well. To be clear, the vast majority of individuals who live in rural Russia at this point in time are relatively unskilled. They're dependent on agriculture. Moreover, most of the prominent institutions, like educational institutions in Russia, are concentrated in Moscow and St. Petersburg. This means if you believe that the educational institutions and investment the Russian state has done, it's preferable to have access to that labor market. Moreover, though, the more people who live in urban areas also makes hiring and firing easier, which means that in general we create better incentives for individuals to work harder because the threat of being fired becomes credible on our side of the house. Thirdly, we believe that on our side of the house, centralization is necessary to maintain rule of law at this point in time. It is 1989. Your state is fragmenting. It is probably good to have most of these foreign companies come in local areas where it's easier to track them and easier to find out what they're doing. If they are right that they want basic levels of regulation to ensure human rights are met and so on, it is better to have them in this local area. Fourth, we believe that in general, it's easier in general to access things like debt covenants and so on when companies are all located in one particular area. This is because most of these companies at this point in time are probably using foreign capital markets to raise capital. The reason this is important is we believe that American and Western European investors are more likely to be fine with bond issuances if it's the case that they're in Moscow because they can easily take a flight to Moscow and figure out what the hell is going on if something goes wrong. Fifth, we believe that in general it's easier for governments to build infrastructure because there are huge economies of scale when firms all co-locate. That is to say, there are basic levels of infrastructure that you need in order to have a stable economy, right? For example, you need to ensure that you have a clean environment. For example, you need to ensure that you have roads and so on, a public infrastructure to make sure people can get to work. I'll take you in a minute. All of this is much easier to do because there are huge economies of scale when it's the case it's all co-located. Go.
Yeah, so Ani, given that on your side of the house, you're not opening up Moscow to foreign direct investment because you're not opening up to foreign corporations that are already banned from being in there.
That was the overview.
Then necessarily, why isn't this just case?
So it's not. Your case is open it up in random areas. Our case is open up in Moscow, right? I've already explained as to why it is competitive, why doing both is strictly worse because you simply cannot afford to do both. Our case, if you want to call it a counter case, fine. We'll call it a counter case as what we're defending on our side of the house. I don't want to get into the theory debate here. I think it detracts from the broad principle. The sixth and final argument I want to make, though, is why we believe regulation itself is easier. Right? I just do think it's the case that when it's the case that you have all these firms in one area, it's easier to locate and so on. What is the implication? Why does this win the round? Why is this the most important consideration? Because they are right to point out there are a bunch of random impacts. But the most important driver for development at this point in time will be foreign direct investment. On their side, they open up to random areas. On ours, we open up to Moscow. We believe all of these reasons, the constellation of these arguments suggests that we get better foreign direct investment because firms have greater incentives to locate in the first place. I promise you, not many firms are going to want to locate in the middle of nowhere on their side of the house. On ours, it's easier to do so. Secondly, though, we believe the quality of FDI is also greater because when it's the case that you have more firms here, you have more diversity of job opportunities for individuals in the first place. People with different skills can get hired and so on. Second argument I want to make, why this destroys rural Russia. So the only possible path to victory then for side opposition is to demonstrate that rural Russians might be better off. So first, on a weighing level, we believe that in general it's preferable to urbanize first. Why? First, there are often spillover benefits, right? You can still spillover benefits when it's the case these companies train workers and so on. Secondly, though, we believe that just because you happen to be ruralized doesn't mean you can't move to urban areas. See what people have done in China recently. Even if you buy the rural people come first. Two reasons why they're worse on their side. First, we believe that on their side of the house, agriculture literally dies. Why? Because firms come in on their side of the house and essentially buy up large tracts of land. We believe the problem with this is people who often made subsistence based on agriculture effectively get displaced. The problem is they don't have a job training program to actually reallocate those benefits. So if you're a rural farmer in Russia, you cannot get a job on their side of the house, so you are left unemployed. Second, we believe that in general, the actual prices that people get for their land is also incredibly low. This is because at this point in time, when lots of firms are coming in, we believe that they can coerce individuals in that way. Why is this important? Because this means the only people who get jobs in their side of the house get paid a lot more than agricultural people. So you create massive systemic inequality in these rural areas of Russia. This is problematic then, because basic goods and services which aren't distributed in those areas often have prices go up because the demand itself is higher and the wealthier people are willing to pay more, which means that inflation that's localized in those areas causes poor Russians to get boxed out. That we say is problematic. Even if they win the foreign direct investment might need to develop in rural areas, it doesn't go to the people who actually matter on case coverage. So the reason I'm only spending like a minute here is not an oversight. The vast majority of the op precludes the PMC and they should get through it to access the arguments here. I'm going to flag the arguments that are relevant because it'll take less time to do that than going through the arguments that aren't. So first, they give us a bunch of reasons why you care about the USSR. True, the question is what's better for USSR. That framework is flawed. Then they say essentially, give us a bunch of econ arguments. Essentially, they say first, foreign direct investment is good. We agree. We're opening up in Moscow. I've already given you reasons why it's preferred. They say that subsistence farmers in general provide only the basic amounts for themselves. So this is not true. They have huge incentives to produce more than just for themselves because then they can make a profit, right? There are economies of scale to agriculture, right? I promise you, if you're a farmer, you're really making a lot more than just putting dinner for yourself because you make an income when it's the case that you sell to other areas in Russia at this point in time. That gets worse on their side. This is especially problematic, by the way, because we tell you to create a huge food shortage at their side of the house as well, right? If all of our arguments about less agriculture are true, you get a huge food shortage in the short term. Why is this a problem? We believe that this itself causes the type of coups in someone that they say are problematic. If the Russian state is collapsing, it's probably bad to have people who are revolting because they don't have food on the table. Then, they say they get better reallocation of government resources. They have a bunch of arguments here. We tell you, however, it is preferable to do it in urban areas, as already explained. Then they say that this will inevitably occur, liberalization will inevitably occur. If that argument is true, the question is whether or not it will occur inevitably in rural areas versus urban areas. We say it is inevitable it will occur in urban areas. I don't know why you create these weird incentive to do it in rural areas first. Then they say that it empowers SOEs. We say SOEs get more competition on our side because most SOEs are in urban areas, which is why those SOEs are better off on our side of the house. At the end of this debate, this isn't a debate as to whether the USSR should liberalize or not. It is a question of the path to development, and that is better on our side of the house. So proud to oppose.
I think the Leader of Opposition calls for a member of government.
You're here. Okay. Is everybody ready? Great. So the first thing that I kind of want to talk about is that I think this is a counter case, despite what Ani may or may not think whether or not this is a counter case. And therefore I think that they have to defend that it's mutually exclusive and like mutually competitive. So I think the only thing that Ani tells us is that like debt, like they can't possibly do both. I don't think this is a real argument, right? I think that the USSR could potentially create these zones in in currently non-urban areas, could also do them in Moscow. The argument that they have a lot of debt is not a real argument as to why they could not do this in both places, given that we tell you that there are going to be economic benefits from this. I think that Nathan is going to do a hell of a lot of work in the MO to prove to you that these are mutually exclusive plans that the USSR could do. But the second thing that I want to talk about is the reason why case is set up so that we are not defending urban areas is because we think that these I just don't know what Ani thinks that Moscow looks like right now. Like Moscow is an urban city. St. Petersburg is an urban city. These cities already have development. The reason that we didn't want to do the plan in Moscow and in St. Petersburg is because we think it already exists there in the status quo. We think that internal investment is already happening, that the universities exist there, that manufacturing exists there, that industry exists there, which is why we think that there are almost no benefits on their side of the house to doing this because it already exists given internal investment. No thank you. Therefore, we think that on our side of the house that you get benefits of doing it otherwise. We would also tell you in a world where you continue to develop Moscow, continue to develop St. Petersburg, means that you get things like urban sprawl, when anyone who was currently working in agriculture, in order to get a manufacturing job, in order to live in an urban center, no thank you, has to move to Moscow, has to move to St. Petersburg, which means that ultimately you build up these cities and you don't have any other development in the rest of Russia, which means you get all of the harms of urban sprawl, all of those things are bad, which means that you have a lack of development in the rest of Russia. We think that that's going to be bad. No thank you. The first thing they tell us is basically urbanization is good, right? They give us 6 reasons as to why urbanization is good. All of these things can also apply to building other urban centers. I think that almost none of these things are unique. Some of the unique things that they might, I'm not going to take the far
question right now. Some of the things that like they tell us is that like it's better you have better access to labor markets. Okay, so they tell us you have better access to labor markets because you have education in Moscow. They tell you that the kind of manufacturing that the USSR is looking to do means that you don't necessarily need skilled labor. But I think that Frankie tells you on case that you have like mild, like mid-level skilled labor that exists in the rest of Russia, which means that you do have the skilled labor in other parts of Russia in order to be able to do things. They tell you that you can like track them when you're in Moscow. When you build other urban centers, I don't know why you wouldn't be able to like track and monitor the things that are happening. Like I just don't know if this is a real argument. No, thank you. Then they tell you that investors are going to want to come. I think that exists on either side of the house. The fifth thing they tell you is like it's easier to build infrastructure because you have economies of scale. So I think that we address this too, right? I think that on their side of the house, the Moscow and St. Petersburg become so large that you can't possibly regulate the urban sprawl. We would also tell you that given that Moscow has proven themselves to be bad at regulation, has proven themselves to be bad at urban planning, no thank you, that there is no reason why they are going to continue to be better at this when Moscow just gets so large that you literally can't regulate anything. It'll take you hours to drive from one side of Moscow to the other, given how big the Russian population is. Therefore, I think no thank you. Therefore, I think it is better to build multiple urban centers where you can actually regulate, where you can actually like have the infrastructure to be able to drive across the city in one day. The last thing you tell you is regulation is easier. I don't think this is true. I think it exists on either side of the house. Then they say that it is going to destroy rural Russia, that it is preferable to urbanize first. So they tell you that agriculture is going to die because firms are going to buy lots of land. So I don't know what they think that agriculture is going to do. I don't know they say that the firms are going to be coercive, that it's going to create systematic inequality. I think that this exists in the status quo. I think that on our side of the house, we give people who currently live in rural Russia, who live on the eastern half of Russia is huge, and there are no cities in it. We give these people a chance to have real jobs as opposed to being stuck as peasant farmers. Like the people, if you meet someone from Russia right now and ask them where they're from, they go say Moscow or St. Petersburg because the rest of Russia has not been urbanized. Like none of the labor markets that are being tapped into. And I think on our side of the house, we have unique access to those labor markets. But I think what we tell you, which is also unique on our side of the house, that we tell you in case, is that when you draw these special economic zones, that you can draw them so they don't include the resources, so that on our side of the house, you can still uniquely access those resource markets as the USSR. We tell you when you that's going to be better on our side of the house. Let's go on case, because I don't think they address a lot of the things that we tell you. Also, Ani, do you have a question?
No, right now, that's been it.
Okay. So the first thing we tell you is about the goals of the USSR. We tell you that you have to legitimize based on the quality of life. So I think that when you only continue to urbanize in Moscow and St. Petersburg, they fundamentally don't improve the quality of life for the rest of the population living in Russia, which means that you necessarily don't meet this burden. We tell you that as the USSR, that you have an obligation to try to improve the economy in these places, given that you are the unique actor that can do so. Given that on their side of the house, they don't try to improve the quality of life for the peasant farmers who are currently living in Russia, who because they didn't do this, still having terrible quality of life means that they don't fulfill this burden as the government. We also tell you that these are the people who are most likely to rise up against you in revolution, given that you are giving them local elections in 1989, you are giving them some taste of freedom. When you don't also improve their quality of life with the economy getting better, then on their side of the house, we are going to have a peasant revolution. On our side of the house, we improve the quality of life by I'll explain later in case. Let me finish this point, then I'll take you. We improve the quality of life by improving agriculture, but we also give these people a path to urbanization. On their side of the house, someone who lives a 9-hour plane ride from Moscow can't have a better job. Yes.
So your one argument as to why it's the case that urbanization is bad is urban sprawl is bad. Which is worse, having a city that's takes 2 hours to get across, or having a bunch of cities which takes days to get one to another?
Sure. I think that having small urban centers is always going to be better. I don't see a reason why you can't regulate them. When Moscow becomes so big that you can't regulate it because you can't know what's going on in all those cities. Smaller cities it is easier to manage. But there are also a lot of other reasons why urban sprawl is bad, like overcrowding and overpollution in these in these cities is going to be bad. The only reason is not that it might take 2 hours to drive across Moscow. I think that all of those impacts are bad. So the next thing that we tell you about is foreign direct investment. They are we can do all of these things on our side of the house. They're definitely good, right? Okay, but I think that you access a unique labor market when you do this on our side of the house with special economic zones. I also think that you specifically encourage foreign direct investment in the other cities, given that you are already trading with the London Bank on their side of the house previously, that you already have some interest in foreign direct investment in places like Moscow. I think that we access unique markets that haven't been tapped before. The West already knows that Moscow and St. Petersburg exist when you give them unique markets to tap into, when you give them unique pools of workers, because the pools of workers on their side of the house fundamentally aren't changing. I don't think you're encouraging a lot of like peasants to move to Moscow, given they've already moved to Moscow, because Moscow has been the urban center in Russia since I think 1400, right? I don't think that you're encouraging any new skilled labor on their side of the house. I don't think that they can solve for that. Next one we tell you is an increase in specialization of industry. We tell you that comparative labor factors. We tell you that you do have skilled labor. We tell you that they're going to be closer to markets, which means that they're going to like be able to better access their jobs. We tell you about the impacts of this, like money stays in the USSR. We tell you that you get associated products with the USSR. The next thing we talk to you about is increased agricultural production. They're like, they don't have an incentive to do this, and there are going to be food shortages in the short term. So no, we tell you that like investment in the short term. So we tell you that subsistence farmers don't have an incentive to produce in the status quo above the subsistence level. We also tell you that they are currently competing with other people on farms. That when my farm is runs right up against Frankie's farm, and then Frankie goes off to work in a factory, that now I have all of this land that I can farm on, and I can make more above the subsistence level, right? Which means that I am going to be able to produce more, to have more capital. We tell you that's going to be good. I don't think there are going to be food shortages. Rather, we tell you that collectivization and better and bigger farms are going to be better for producing more agriculture in Russia. I think that currently they have a famine. I think that we solve for this better. On their side of the house, they don't affect farming at all, which means on their side of the house, they have to defend against the famines which are currently happening in the status quo. We tell you that we solve for this collectivization. I don't think we do anything just also on their side of the house. We also improve these people's quality of life and we give them more capital. They're like, but firms are going to buy them out at low prices. We don't think they have an incentive to do that, given that things are already cheap. We tell you that we have better allocation of government resources. We tell you that we increase closeness, demand, and surplus of labor, which leads to better wages. We tell you about our side of the house, you can actually get people to decide. Then we tell you the economy outside of these zones is going to be better.
I think member of government call upon the member of opposition.
So, 3 questions in this speech. First, what is the advocacy on both sides? What are we defending? What are they defending? Is it the case that there's actually a clash that allows us to win? And hint, there is. Secondly, given this clash, who's prevailing on 1, what's better for urban areas, and 2, what's better for rural areas? 3, weighing morality in terms of what the goals and motivations of the USSR are. Well, this will be primarily on the flow, but who knows? Cool. So the advocacy that we provide is that instead of providing special economic zones in predominantly rural areas or small cities, you ought to concentrate the largest areas predominantly to the west of the Ural. So Moscow, St. Petersburg, classic urban Russia, right? They tell us, first of all, that this isn't mutually exclusive. 1, we would advance that competitiveness is the better standard in this case. You as a Russian policymaker are typically thinking about whether, even if you could do both, whether it makes sense to do both. I.e., if I'm building 2 bridges across a river, even if I can build both, if one is in a better location, silly idea to do that. But secondly, we do think that this is mutually exclusive for 2 reasons. First, debt crunch. They try to laugh this off by saying that you are able to do it in both cases, right? Ani specifically explains to you that you're foregoing substantial amounts of tax revenue from FDI and so on, meaning that if it's the case that you're going to be able to balance your budget and so on, it's only the case you can subsidize it in 2 areas. But secondly, just on a philosophy of language, it is analytically true that a special economic zone is special because it is different from somewhere else, right? If you liberalize everywhere, then there is no such thing as a special economic zone. It's is it a participation trophy for economic zones? I'm just confused. Cool. So more importantly, jokes aside, competitiveness is the better standard. I think it's intuitive that even if you can do this, we want to subsidize urban development. That's what our advocacy is. Their advocacy is subsidize rural development. What is the comparative? We get 3 what I'm going to call off case arguments about why it's the case that it's good to subsidize rural development. The first is on the comparative. You already have development in urban areas. It is better to engage in this in rural areas. The uncharitable interpretation of this argument is, no, it's a comparative debate. You ought to, subsidize these individuals more. The more charitable interpretation, which I don't think that we actually heard, is that on the comparative, it's the case that the diminishing marginal utility of investing in urban areas is less. But this just begs the question, right? Because Ani gave you all sorts of reasons why it's the case that we ought to subsidize this development, right? There are positive externalities from investing in an urban area, i.e., other people have access to your networks and skills, just as though we ought to subsidize early fax machines, for example, because there's a network externality from my buying a fax machine, meaning that you are more likely to do so too. I'll do this in the case. The second and more serious argument that we get is that urban sprawl is really bad, and so we don't want to subsidize that. Couple responses. First, there is a natural equilibrium that takes place. It is not the case that every dollar of foreign direct investment winds up in urban areas, most do. So if it is truly the case that there is enormous amounts of sprawl, eventually things shift. We just say that the optimum is closer to our side than their side. Secondly, though, there is a positive externality relative to urban sprawl versus rural bloat. Like, on the comparative, even if there are substantial amounts of sprawl on our side of the house, the geography of the interior of Russia is such that it's not the case that there is going to be even more sprawl. Thirdly and finally, and this is specifically trading off the notion of pollution and regulation and so on, is more difficult in these areas. We would posit that there are two reasons why you get worse sprawl and worse regulation in rural areas. The first is that the central government is weaker in rural areas. This means that it's not the case that you can control things like urban sprawl with better central planning, that the more sophisticated individuals and so on are more likely to be in the urban area. Secondly is that there is a strong incentive on the parts of urban elites who have more power to make it such that they themselves can get to work and so on, right? And make sure that they themselves are not threatened by other individuals. But this means that you have incentives to make Moscow and St. Petersburg minimally powerful. Whereas if you are a governor who lives in a province that is 1,000 miles away from your peers in Siberia, you have absolutely no incentive to make sure that the nuclear waste facility that is published by MNC is actually going to not pollute and so on. So you get more pollution in rural areas. It's actually also empirically true. Think about the middle of the United States, for example. Now going back to the on case, because even if you buy that there is actually sure.
Yeah, so Nathan, given that you are no longer going to tax anybody in your cities, and you need those tax revenues to be able to pay off your foreign debt, how are you going to be able to pay off your foreign debt, even if you choose to only have one sort of
There are so many ways of raising revenue based on economic growth generally. Thing number one, you can levy some sort of property tax, right? You can tax land in these areas. Land values go up. You can tax all sorts of things. Moreover, we would posit, even if your tax revenues are lower, for reasons that I'm going to explain in a minute, in the status quo, collecting taxes in rubles, as they tell you in construct, is absolutely jack shit. The thing that we're going to explain to you in a minute is that we actually stabilize Russia's currency, which is preferable. This goes into the weighing that I'm going to do right now. Ani gives you a blizzard of reasons why urban capital is better. I'm going to extend the few that I think are most important. The first argument that he gives you that you have more skilled labor on the comparative. They say that there is skilled labor in rural areas. This is a comparative debate. I promise you the graduates in math at Moscow University are a lot more sophisticated than those beyond the Urals. Secondly, that he tells you is that there's more centralization and rule of law. This is a cross-application of the argument that I gave earlier, right? It's just the case that you can better control things. The two other arguments that are incredibly important, though, are first, debt. What happens on their side of the house is they get a lot less investment. Because when it is the case that JP Morgan Chase or Goldman Sachs has to fly out their people into the boonies where they really don't want to go in order to underwrite debt, or because it's unclear even what is going on in these rural areas, where people aren't as likely to speak English, for example, it is much less likely that you're able to get the kind of underwriting that exists. This is incredibly important because an influx of foreign capital is the single most important thing to stabilize the Russian ruble right now, right? Recognize that there's massive depreciation because people are unsure whether Russia is going to be able to keep its currency reserves to the point where it's going to have to depeg from the dollar. In fact, this is what's going to happen in about 10 years in the Russian debt crisis. But that means that the single most important thing is for Russia to have an influx of foreign currency into the country. This is a direct cross-application to their tax points. Even if your tax receipts drastically decrease in nominal terms, they also substantially increase in real terms because you now actually have foreign currency to back your own ruble. Final thing that we told you is infrastructure, right? The response that we get is no, that people are bad at urban planning, right? But one, we told you that you get incentives to get better urban planning than on their side of the house. But secondly, it's not like it's like rocket science, that it's you need electricity in these areas, right? The basic things that make it a lot more difficult to build things in rural areas make it that it's the case. So at this point, realistically, the only path to victory that they have is to extend things off of why rural areas are better and why that's a problem. So I'm going to blend the second argument on Ani's off case with all of the on case. The first thing that they tell you is that the goals of the USSR are to promote quality of life generally, right? They say that when you promote the quality of life for peasants, you don't have to do this. One, weigh on any spillover benefits against this. When there is substantially more development in urban areas, it is easier to use these revenues to engage in these other sorts of prospects. Secondly, though, we told you that urban individuals also have quality of life, right? So that matters too. The next thing they tell you is that there will be a revolution in these areas because people will be really upset, right? First, it's not like things in urban areas are so great either, right? The Russian economy is in the tank because there isn't effective governance anywhere, right? But secondly, recognize that there is a huge transaction cost to revolutions. Recognize that even when the Soviet Union was becoming increasingly repressive in the 1970s, there wasn't a revolution because it just takes a lot to make you want to take up arms for your country. Thirdly, note that because of the USSR's past and so on, people don't have arms that they can even use in this context, so revolution is not likely. Next thing they tell you is that special economic zones are better for agriculture, people we dispossess. They make two arguments here that are inconsistent with one another. The first thing they tell you is that people are only practicing subsistence farming. Question, where is Russia's domestic food production coming from, right?
Yeah.
Given that this is the case, and given that there is an obvious incentive for people to sell something on the market, this exists. Secondly, though, they tell you that subsistence farmers will be interested in selling their land because prices are low and then they'll be able to move elsewhere. Then they say that people won't be interested in buying land because prices are low, right? This is inconsistent. If prices are low, then the question is whether or not firms will think that it's lower. But if the prices are high, the question is whether or not individuals will be able to move. The more sophisticated comparative that we give you is that the money will be of greater value to large multinational corporations with large amounts of liquid assets to invest than for a peasant farmer that doesn't have a ton of capital to invest. This means that they are more likely to be taken off their land, which is incidentally empirically what we see in situations like this. What this means is that on their side of the house, they do create a massive food shortage because people tend to buy up stuff incredibly proud to oppose.
Okay. Thank you, member of opposition. Recall the leader of opposition.
Okay. I want to quickly start with the stuff about mutual exclusivity. I just don't think this is where the round is going, but just to clarify things to avoid shenanigans in PMR. So to be clear, we're saying that even if this case isn't technically mutually exclusive, it is in practice, right? You just don't have the money to do both, right? So, for example, right, if we're talking about spending large sums of money to subsidize development in California or Ohio, and the government is seriously debt constrained, it simply cannot do both. But even if it can do both, we give you a litany of arguments as to why their policy uniquely of subsidizing both rural and urban development is worse than just doing urban development. So even if you buy that it's not technically mutually exclusive, I think Nathan pretty cleanly explains as to why competitiveness is a better standard. Given that, let's take the best case scenario for a proposition is to make. Let's suppose that all you care about are the rural poor in Russia. That's all you care about. First, as I explained in LOC, I don't see as to why this necessarily outweighs, but we'll beat them on their turf anyway. Why is this the case? We gave you two arguments that just simply were not answered properly in the previous speech. First, we tell you there's massive systematic inequality that they create on their side. Because when it's the case that firms buy up this land, not everyone in rural areas who are practicing farming have the skills to work at those firms. This means the kind of individuals who get jobs in rural areas are those who are the most skilled, they get paid more, and the people who are farming don't have access to those jobs. Why is this a problem? I explained in LOC this drives the price for goods in those rural areas. Given the fact there isn't infrastructure, the prices aren't the same as in Moscow, which is why on their side they price out the poorest Russians. Why is this the controlling link? Because we tell you, even if Russians in rural areas have slightly worse jobs, having access to a job that allows you to put food on the table for your family is still preferable to being boxed out of a job, still having the same thing, and having prices now skyrocket, which is effectively what they do on their side. We tell you, if you care about the worst job, which is necessary for this philosophical argument, it is self-cannibalizing. But second, more importantly, they do not answer the argument about food shortage properly. We told you from the get-go, firms will just simply buy up large tracts, causing huge food shortages. Why is this a problem? Because food shortage affects those in the rural areas the most because they're the ones who are least politically affiliated. If they care so much about poor individuals, having an agricultural crisis is probably a bad thing, and it's necessary to access all the other good things in life, right? We tell you that the most basic use of money is food, everything else comes secondary. So at a weighing level, even if you buy that people get slightly better jobs, the food shortage they create because the food simply isn't available outweighs that thing. That means we win the rural areas on just a weighing level. Let's say you don't buy that, though. We tell you urban people come first. Why? First, there's just a possibility to move. I just don't see as to why you should subsidize random people when there is the possibility to move. Secondly, though, we tell you that even if there's something more people who live in these urban areas, right? It just targets more people, right? If you care about obligations to Russians, why don't you care about maximizing that there? Thirdly, we tell you there are spillover benefits as well when there's upskill in that country. The way in which most countries in Africa developed, or the way in China developed, is through subsidizing urban areas because then you upskill, causing a big upskill there. But finally, though, we tell you rural people are even worse affected when there's a currency collapse. Only on our side do we stabilize the currency. That outweighs, because even if you get some sort of nominal growth at their side, it doesn't translate into goods on the ground. So at a weighing level, we believe the actual stabilization of the currency is the controlling link for rural people, but urban people come first for the reasons I told you. This is where the debate becomes super clear, right? Because we tell you very simply, there's large amounts of foreign direct investment that we get that they simply do not. Why is this the case? Because we tell you that on our side of the house, on theirs, they just say, Moscow's already developed. No, you don't have access to foreign capital, which is like a huge development boost we get, right? On their side of the house, even if they just subsidize both rural and urban areas, all the firms won't just locate in Russia. Some will locate in random areas so you don't get all of the benefits we talk about. What were those? We talked about how you get more foreign capital. We talked about how you get more labor skill. We're just getting a clinic of mitigation saying, it's non-unique. It also exists in urban and rural areas too. Just gut check this, right? I promise you, someone who went to Moscow State University, probably a lot more educated than someone in the boondocks of Russia. They talk about how it's harder to regulate. The one real argument here is it's harder to regulate because in general, Russia will become too large. The problem for them is there's less of an incentive in the with the outskirts, because in those areas we tell you there's less of an incentive, as Nathan explained, to actually do this. All to do this. Then they say the urban sprawl, as we already explained, this is not an issue, right? If you believe urban sprawl is a problem, they never properly impacted our ratings, right? The best possible scenarios of this big claim of environmental harm. It's probably easier to regulate that when it's all in one city, and you can give zoning, as Nathan talks about. I don't think that's a real issue. Even if you grant them full solvency on that, though, we tell you the controlling link here is having access to jobs. When Target, Walmart, banks, and other firms are able to move into these areas and provide jobs for individuals, that leads to real change. That leads to development. At the end of this debate, this isn't a question as to whether or not we get development versus no development. It's a question as to where you develop and how you actually get on a path to long-run economic change. We're so proud of that.
I think the Leader of Opposition recalls 5 minutes.
You're here.
Everybody ready? I think given the comparison within this round, I think it is really damning when they don't ever actually engage with the impacts Julie draws when they concede inevitability. When they've conceded that in the next couple of years that they are going to open the country up for foreign investment, regardless of where you are, so it doesn't matter where the special economic zones lived. This means that the most attractive places were the places you didn't have to incentivize. And in fact, Ani gives you a lovely list of 7 reasons, which is why we don't engage with them, because they cut back against them. Given that that is the case, both sides achieved the same levels of foreign direct investment in Moscow. The question then becomes, who actually gets it in other places as well? Because then this becomes a 1 versus 1 plus quite a few other game, which I think is incredibly problematic for them. What do they tell us in terms of tax revenue? They tell us either they're going to trade off with other things, in which case they're going to get very little investment to return. Here's the problem with this issue. They still need to be able to do things like pay government workers in rubles, which still means the government still needs to be collecting rubles. So even though Nathan and Ani really just wanted to talk about foreign currency, domestic currency is so incredibly important. Moreover, when they tell us that they have a they get an increase in foreign currency, this is not a problem, because we get the increase in foreign currency with or without them doing the special economic zones. Here's the difference, and the other thing they drop out of Julie's speech. We told you the special economic zones don't need to be subsidized heavily by the government. Why? When you encourage people to move there, for the corporations that would move into these areas, they're the ones doing the things like funding the central planning, like funding the development in infrastructure. So Ani has just shot himself in the foot by deciding to just deal with the place that was already going to build itself on their own. The question then becomes, would you rather have 1 special economic zone or 100 special economic zones? We think given that special economic zones have been conceded to be good in this round, we are easily going to win. What do they tell us especially is unique about Moscow? Capital investors, in absence of any other incentive, like Moscow because they know where it is, they can get on a plane. That means his JP Morgan is going to get on a plane regardless of which world you're in. The question then becomes, does JP Morgan develop in Western Europe or in Western Russia? Does it develop in Eastern Russia? Does it develop where everybody else would be gaining benefits?
Sorry, I actually do think this is a bit new. So the argument in PMC, as I have it float, is that it's inevitable that Russia will liberalize. I think it is new analysis to say that that inevitability means that urbanization in particular will occur, which is why like JP Morgan will still go into 2 years, especially in the POI they ask about how like there's bars on business status quo.
Okay, so I'm going to deal with those things backwards. 1, the bar question was a clarification of what their counter case was as a POI. Going backwards from that, the argumentation we make in case is that it is inevitable that foreign corporations are always going to happen. Julie then takes this argument in MG and applies it to the new comparison we are given versus the counter case, in which she says, if it is inevitable, then the comparison is, do you get places outside Moscow with or without special economic zones? So obviously up to the
will
panel.
be taken under consideration by the panel.
They also drop out of case why it is the most important to have a maximum number of special economic zones and the most amount of corporations. We tell you it allows for a counterbalancing against which inevitably becomes the liberalization of natural resources within Russia. Spoiler alert, this is why you have issues with oil in Russia. We tell you when you have the maximum amount of corporations in different zones, they lobby against the interests of the natural resources because they care about the inputs that they would otherwise provide that make it comparatively good to be in Russia. Given that that is the case, more special economic zones are always important. What harms could they be doing to Moscow that make this comparison even clearer? They say, well, they're just going to shift the equilibrium, and somehow that is going to deal with sprawl. I ask question, Nathan, the equilibrium of what? and they never actually give you any reasons or warrants why the equilibrium is going to shift. Moreover, they drop the warrant that in the first place, Russia has a design, or Moscow has a design failure, given the previous failures of central planning because of the corruption within the government. Any increase in central planning is only going to be built on problematic things. This means you have large plots of land within the middle of Moscow that have no businesses. This is incredibly inefficient. Then the comparison then becomes not just urban sprawl, but rather, are you able to have most efficient central planning that is invested by corporations, so you're not wasting Russian dollars on this. You are necessarily only having that. What is in the counterbalancing preferability of all of the other zones? Couple different things. One, you are maximizing the number of people that are inherently going to be going to these zones. What do they tell us? They actually give you this warrant. They say transportation is very difficult in Russia. Julie turns this very cleanly and empty when she tells you if that is the case, the people out in eastern Russia that they are worried about not having skilled jobs are never going to make it to Moscow, meaning you're leaving out substantial portions of the population that already want to revolt against the communist government they don't like without any hope, and simply doubling down on the efforts of places they are already envious of, like Moscow. This is an incredible problem. Secondly, the job competitions. They tell us state-run enterprises are primarily in places like Moscow. They're not incorrect, but what's the problem when they allow for SEZ, or foreign corporations, to take over the state-run industries because they're only focusing on Moscow? You don't allow for the interchange of competition. This means that prices still stay high, and the pseudo-state-run industries, when they're merged with foreign direct investment and foreign competition. Moreover, they drop that there's no alternatives for labor, so labor is forced to take whatever the bottom of the rung because everybody races to the bottom.
The specific argument that FDI will take place such that foreign investors acquire a controlling stake in the SOEs is very good.
Okay, so specifically the arguments we are comparing here is they talk about foreign direct investment is going to help state-run industries. We tell you this is basically just a repeating of PMC, just the merge. Now it's just like a comparison of the state-run industries merged with the foreign direct investment, which is their plan, instead of comparing to status quo. Compared to this means that the lack of jobs and labor and competition between the two, which the warrant doesn't change whether or not the comparison is quo or their countercase.
So is the point where we're taking under consideration?
Cool. Okay. Final question then becomes, this next two questions become, how do you get skilled individuals? I think given that they don't ever increase these skills available, because even just training in a factory, not just going to Moscow State University, actually increases your training and increases productivity. Given that that is the case, we get more productive labor. Finally, with the issue with the farming, we told you the comparison for corporations is either forcing people off the land or taking empty land and paying people who are still in the tracks in between. We tell you corporations before that, that's how you don't have the issues of farming.